For the metal parts of the gramophone, I decided on a hybrid approach. So the parts that were, well, let's say most damaged by rust or oxidation, I decided to give them a base coating, and I'll paint them in the original color they were when they were still, let's say, good. So these two parts had a silvery metal kind of color, so that's what I'll do. I'll give them a sort of flat platinum shine and a layer of lacquer. These two parts had lost their surface coating completely, so they were reduced to just simple pieces of steel. So flat steel, unappealing, and anyway they would have kept on rusting. The same thing with the hinges, although they weren't originally painted in a silvery color, or at least they didn't have a silvery surface, but rather a copper or gold tinted color. So that's what I'll do with these. I'll give them a sort of worn golden surface layer, yeah, so that they'll appear not too brand new, but still reasonably fresh. And of course a layer of translucent lacquer to protect them from moisture and rusting. Same thing with the lever with which to wind up the mechanism of the gramophone. So this was probably the part that was most damaged of all by rust. So unfortunately for me, most of the superficial layer, the gleaming white silvery layer that was on top of the lever was gone. It was actually 100% rust, so I had to take off all the rust. Then I gave it a base coat, yeah, and I'll paint it a sort of dull platina color to give it its original looks back. Right, and then we come to the main parts of the gramophone, which is the tone arm. And that I simply cleaned up and as well as I could, and I gave it a coating of transparent lacquer. I could have repainted it in the same kind of platinum color it must have had originally, or maybe silvery color, but I decided against it. I mean, these parts are sort of the heart of the gramophone, and you really don't want to mess with what constitutes the actual main piece of some appliance. So the only thing I actually did was clean them thoroughly, and then I gave them both a layer of transparent lacquer to protect them against rust. So that's where we are. The next thing I'll need to give a layer of anti-rust and base coating are the platter, which carries the actual well, disc to play, and well, maybe the handles, the door handles. Those, they are lacquered black, but I think I might give them a metal appearance instead of black, but we'll see. So anyway, that's it for now. I sort of improvised a small production line for painting all the parts, and you can see all the parts that I'm painting in different stages of painting. So for example, this part here just got a second layer of base coating, whereas that one got his first layer of finish coating, okay, which by the way is this color here, which is called white aluminium satin matte. It has an RAL code 9006, which I think is an international color code. Okay, so anyway, the hinges were originally a dull deep gold or bronze color, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to paint the top of the hinges in the exact same dull bronze color. All the parts of course will get a layer of lacquer to protect them against rusting or corrosion in general. Also, I'm painting the crankshaft with which to crank the spring of the gramophone, and it's the same dull aluminum color that I'm giving it, but with a layer of lacquer. It will get the right kind of metallic luster in the end. So anyway, aside from all these parts, what I've got to prepare now is the edge of the turntable, well, the disc platter in fact. So that's what I'm going to do next. It's not as easy as it sounds, because I don't want to damage the top, which is a kind of purplish velvet, and well, I can't dip it into acid obviously, nor even in navel jelly, so I'm constricted to using sandpaper only. Okay, I'm getting ready to treat the edge of the turntable, which is quite rusty, but to protect the felt layer on top I used painter's tape to cover it off. So now I'm going to use some navel jelly to treat the edges. I did the rough work with some fine grit sandpaper, and I'm going to finish it with navel jelly. The motor of the gramophone is not too hard to understand, and this is a close-up of it. I'm going to give it a greasing with this kind of lithium grease, just to keep the motor going smoothly, which is important of course in a gramophone. Anyway, this is more or less how it works. So you have two parts in the motor really. You have, let me show you, you have on the right side this large box here, round box, and this box is connected via a cog you see on top there, okay, to this axle here, with a worm wheel right in the middle of it. Okay, now as you can see, the axle has two little pins sticking out of it, and that is where the winding lever slots onto to wind up the mechanism. So you would wind up the spring, a heavy steel spring which is contained within this box, and really inside the box there's a small ratchet mechanism which allows you to tighten the spring without it uncoiling immediately. So that's, let's say, the most important part, and that is which provides all the driving force for the motor. Now, underneath the spring box, you see a much larger cogwheel which grips a smaller one over there, which in turn drives a slightly bigger cogwheel, which itself drives the shaft of the gramophone. Yeah, the shaft being this here. Okay, now in the middle of the shaft, down there, yeah, let me show you. So right here, this cogwheel here drives another shaft. This one is horizontal and has attached to it, if you look carefully, let me see, 1, 2, 3 weights. Okay, so it has 3 little weights attached to it, which are mounted on small spring leaf blades. You see them. You see the blades right there. Okay, so it's a kind of bluish steel. Now, what a governor does is really to smooth the speed at which the axle drives the record. Okay, so, and I drew a little schematic here. So the governor, which is those 3 weights mounted on a little shaft, okay, the governor at low speed, the weights of the governor are stay close to the shaft, okay, which means that there's, well, the rotational speed is low. If for some reason the axle starts to spin much faster by centripetal force, the weights you see on the governor will be thrown to the outside, yeah, and that will start to slow down the revolutions of the axle. Okay, compare it to a ballerina who turns, yeah, on her toes. When she pulls in her arms, the ballerina will turn very quickly. When she throws her arms out, she will slow down. And that's exactly what the governor does. As the speed increases, the weights will be thrown to the outside and slow down the revolutions of the axle. And that's important to keep the speed constant. If there weren't any governor, the speed at which the axle would turn would be much more erratic and certainly not very constant. Now, there is also another small mechanism. Right at the bottom of the governor, you see this little platter here, yeah, or washer. And above the washer, you see like what looks to be a little hammer. So this part here, okay. At the end of that lever, or that little hammer, there is a small piece of rubber, flat rubber. Now, this here is a lever which is mounted in here, like this. Yeah, and that goes to a knob which is on top of the gramophone. And with that lever, you can lower the rubber, you see down there, to the platter or the washer which is attached to the governor, you see? So you can make the little rubber foot there rub on this platter here. And what this will do is it will slow down, or if you release it, speed up the number of revolutions the main axle will make. Okay, so the little foot will either will actually function more or less like a brake. Yeah, you could say a nice comparison would be that if you're driving a car, you're pushing the gas pedal, yeah, you would push at the same time the brake pedal, yeah. So on the one hand you would supply power, which if you kept supplying it would speed up the car, but by pressing on the brake you slow it down again, and in other words you will keep the speed of the car constant. And it's the same thing with the spindle of the motor. Okay, so the governor is really a little piece of precision mechanic, because as it spins at a rather high speed, vibrations are really very bad. Okay, so this little contraption has been balanced very precisely so as not to vibrate, because obviously if you introduce vibrations into a motor of a gramophone, you will hear those vibrations through the music. So actually this piece of the motor is rather precisely engineered. Anyway, so what I'm going to do next is to put a little bit of grease on all the cogwheels, like I said, lithium grease, and then we'll mount it back inside the gramophone. Now there's one more part I want to show you, and that's this. So this is actually the speed setting for the gramophone. Okay, so, and if you look beneath it, you see there's this little shaft here with a slot, and the slot fits exactly over the lever like this. Oh, hang on, I'm doing this with one hand. There you go. Okay, so it fits over the handle like this, and when you turn this little dial here, you can set more or less pressure, so it will effectively raise or lower this lever here. And as you saw before, since the lever is fixed inside of this here like this, what the lever will do, as you set the height of it with this little contraption, you will move the lever against the brake disc you see right here. Okay, so by setting the height of the lever through this knob, you will set more or less braking on the spindle, and actually on the governor. Okay, so give me a minute, I'll put some grease on it, and then we'll mount it back into the gramophone. Okay, let me show you for a few seconds how the motor works. I shouldn't do this without having the platter mounted on top of the spindle, but just to show you how it actually works, let me show you just right now. There you go. Now we wind up the mechanism. There you go. Okay. So you see the spindle is turning. And you see the governor working over there. Okay. So when pressure is applied on the speed lever, you see that the weights of the governor are pulled down and there's more pressure applied on the brake disc. Okay, so that in effect slows down the engine. Okay, just like I told you. So that's it for now. I applied grease everywhere on all the moving parts, and now we'll mount it back into the gramophone. There is a small addendum I need to give on the working of the governor in the gramophone. As the governor starts to spin faster, okay, the weights are thrown out and it starts to turn slowlier, which of course in turn means that the spindle of the gramophone turns slowlier. Now this, in fact, the brake, like I call it, pushes down the brake plate you see here, which brings in turn the weights of the governor closer to the axle, which in turn makes it spin faster again. In other words, although this has a braking effect, it does, in a sort of a weird way, speed up the turning of the spindle. So by keeping the weights of the governor closer to the axle, it turns faster. So in effect, this is more or less like a speed limiter. Yeah, pretty much like the speed limiter you might have in your car. Okay, so that's what I wanted to add. Before I start reassembling the gramophone, and in fact it's always a good thing whenever you reassemble something, I laid out all the parts that I will need to fix it, yeah, to make the gramophone one unit again. And well, part of it also is to know where to start first and where to end, and also to see which parts might be needed to be replaced and which are still good to keep. So here they are, all the parts of the gramophone. Okay, so you have the bolts with which to mount the motor back to the cabinet. You have the tone arm and the tone head over there. You have the speed regulator arm and the speed regulator knob. You have all the hinges and the lid arm. You have the logo shield and the knobs for the doors, as well as needles and tiny little screws for the tone arm, which are inside the needle cup over there, which I keep close because the parts are really tiny and I don't want to lose them. So now I have to decide where to start, and the thing is, it's always best to start with the simplest parts first and the ones that are least critical. So in other words, it's best to start mounting, for example, the hinges to the cabinet or the knobs of the little doors, because those are least critical. What is most critical is the tone arm, because it's a very sensitive piece of equipment, and all the tiny little parts that go with it, which are in the little cup over there, and at the very last step, the logo. We still need to select a good spot for the logo. What am I not going to use? Well, most of the screws are either bald or rusted or bent, and they're really, well, they're really not that good anymore. So I'll keep them as let's say a reminder of what was used in the past, but I won't use them again. And there are a whole bunch of those screws over there which were used to mount the hinges, and I'm not going to use those either. They are rusted or bent or broken, so no, I'm not going to use those either. And then there are the so-called rubber mounts for the motor. Okay, I started to mount all the non-essential parts first, you know, just to get them out of the way and to get a sort of a clear playing field. So what I'm going to mount next is the motor. One of the problems with the motor was that it was originally suspended from these 4 pins you see here, which are threaded, yeah, and it was suspended from the holes you see here in the cabinet. Okay, now on top of the cabinet were these rather ugly rubber washers, and there was a bolt on top. In fact, you can still see the imprint of a bolt there, and I'm talking about the bolt you see over there. Now, the whole point of these rubber washers is to dampen any kind of vibration coming from the motor, yeah, which would be otherwise audible via the pickup head you see over there. Now, these rubbers, first of all, they are old and rather stiff. They are not very flexible anymore. And really, the way the motor was suspended, these washers wouldn't have done zip, okay, because the motor, you see here, was tightened really hard against the wood of the gramophone. So any vibrations which would have emanated from the motor would still have propagated through the wood of the gramophone. So really, these washers were actually totally useless. So what I'm planning to do myself is to use these rubber washers you see here. Okay, let me show you. So I'm going to use washers like these, okay, and these fit exactly over the threaded ends you see there. So I'm going to place 4 washers on the threaded pins you see here, then pass the pins through the cabinet holes you see over there, and then place another 4 washers on top, and then place a metal washer and a bolt on top of that, and that will allow to dampen a lot of the vibrations coming from the motor. And anyway, let's face it, these washers are ugly and old, and they are pretty useless now, so I won't use these any longer. So the next step is mounting the motor. I'm nearly done completely reassembling the gramophone, and as you can tell, I'm close to finishing the last few details, and one of the important details was to mount back the tone arm, the gramophone's pickup arm. And there is a nice little detail about this. You'll remember that this U-shaped elbow here had at one end a part of it cut away, and that actually has a very important function, which is that you'll agree with me that the pressure the needle puts on a record is crucial to how quickly the needle will wear out the sound groove in the record. Now, to sort of compensate for that, for the pressure of the pickup head, there is this little screw you see right here where I put my finger, okay? It's a tiny screw. And what that screw does is it butts against both ends of that slot which was cut away from the end of this U-shaped tube, so that in effect, if you move it around, it butts like this in the rest position, and when you turn it back in the other position, it abuts against the screw, but as you can tell, it can never move further than this. So the effect of this is effectively taking away some of the weight of this tone arm away from the surface of the disc. Not all of it, obviously, but still just enough to not ruin completely the record. Obviously, this is very primitive, okay? I mean, the pickups of nowadays have very complicated counterbalanced tone arms where you can set up to 100 of a gram of weight on the needle, etc. But hey, you know, this is experimental technology almost. So I think they were still trying to discover how to make a gramophone work as well as it could have. Okay, so let me put the finishing touches to the gramophone, and then I'll show you the end result. I mounted back the speed lever, which you see here, okay, and it's mounted to the knob on top. And as you can tell down there, the speed lever, well, it's kind of hard to show you inside, but the speed lever leverages this little leg here, which at its end has the rubber pad which rubs on the brake plate. You see here, the brake disc, okay, right there where my finger is. Now, I can show you more or less what the effect is. So if I twist the knob on top, watch how the little lever moves. So this will make it go faster, So I turn the knob counterclockwise, and you can see a very slight move upwards of the brake lever. So this part here, okay. Now if I turn clockwise, that would theoretically slow down the engine. So watch the little lever as I turn the knob. I think you can just about see it, but it's really, really minimal, okay? It's absolutely minimal. But, you know, probably it doesn't take a lot to regulate the speed of the gramophone. So anyway, this is it. It's completely assembled. So let me show you how it looks now. And here it is, completely finished, cleaned and revised. And this is probably more or less like how it should have looked back in the day. I say more or less, of course, because I can't be sure of the color choice they made back then. But in any case, everything has been lacquered, cleaned, revised, and I think it should work without too much problem. Unfortunately, I don't have a disc to try it out, but I'm sure once I hand it over, there will be a disc handy and we'll try it out, and I'll make a little video of it. In any case, this is pretty much how it must have looked in a day. Yeah, and here's the tone arm. Okay, so, and as you can tell, you can lift up the pickup head or set it down and it will never go beyond a certain point, yeah, thanks to the little stop inside the tone arm. Okay, so, and probably it was put down like this onto the disc. Okay, now within the head, of course, there's this little contraption here, right here, yeah, and the only thing you need to do really is to use it is to unscrew this little knurled screw here like this, and then you would take a needle from the little cup here and introduce the needle right here like this and tighten the little knurled screw like this, and that would be the needle that would pick up the sound. And as you can tell, it's quite an impressive needle. I wouldn't like to get this needle in my finger, but hey, you know, that's technology from the 1920s, so you know, they did the best they could with what they had, and I suppose for a while at least it served perfectly. So there you go, that's 1920s technology, and it's an Elektrolady. Cool, isn't it? So yeah, it's ready to be packed and to be handed over to my friend. I'm sure she will like it. She always wished to have one of these. So, well, off it goes. And I hope you enjoyed watching how I restored an old gramophone from somewhere between 1920 and 1930 of the brand Elektrolady.